hoping you can all hear me and fully visible. My name is Chris Whitaker. I'm the chair of the management committee for BASIS, and the webinar today is being facilitated by Martin Charter, who I'll let introduce the other members of the panel to you. But we've got a professional athlete, a young professional athlete who's looking to kind of make his mark and gave it away and play for his country at some point. And then we have another athlete who has actually represented and skippered his country at international level as an amateur. So I'll leave you to guess who they are, and Martin can figure out who I'm talking about.
I figured it out already.
But yeah, thank you all for joining. This is going to be an interesting conversation, and it's about looking at sustainable sportswear and sustainable equipment in the sports industry. And today we're going to look particularly at cricket, because that's something of a passion of Martin's. And I thought I'd wear my club kit today, just to kind of emphasize the point that the base layer I've got on is a sustainably made, traceable product made from bamboo, whereas the top I've got on is 100% polyester made in Indonesia with absolutely no traceability on it at all. So it probably underlines, where the sector is. And so that's really what the discussion's going to be about. In terms of asking questions, there'll be a section for that, and we absolutely would like to get you involved at the discussion points. And so please raise your hand, and Martin will bring you into the conversation when the time is right. Okay, I'll hand over to Martin. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Chris. And we're going to split this into 3 sections. We're going to have a couple of presentations by myself and Yashi, who I'll introduce in a minute. And then we'll have a 20-minute panel discussion, and then we'll open up for 10 minutes of questions from the audience. And as Chris mentioned, we have our chairman, Chris, who's ex-ECB and many things. Many of you, of course, will know. Joe from Glamorgan County Cricket Club, but also ex-Durham graduate, did a thesis around climate change, as far as I understand it, and did a lot of traveling and seeing a lot of stuff. And we got Yashi, who is the director of Project Kahani, amongst other things, and did her master's thesis at Harvard around sustainability issues in venues and facilities. And then we got Niall, who is associate director of the Sports Lab, and I'm sure many other things he's involved in as well. So my name is Martin Charter. I've got a background in sustainability and various things for about 20 years. My cricket claim to fame is when I was 18, I was a semi-finalist of the Sun Wrights Coal Tar Spin for England competition with Les Lenham, the national coach, many years ago. And when I played club cricket for the Surrey Championship, I got Graham Thorpe out, but he was very young then. But I'm too old now to play, so I'm talking about it rather than play. So I'll now, hopefully we'll get the technology working. Can everybody see the slide? Can somebody just shout out? Hopefully you can see it. You can see the slide? Hello?
No, it isn't showing, Martin.
Oh, right.
Anna?
I can't see it, no.
Can you facilitate the sharing on the screen?
I haven't got the slide.
Okay, no, it's I've worked it out. So another classic Zoom moment. But anyway, so myself and Yashi Dajic, I pronounce, sorry, I always would say Yashi, going to present, and maybe I'll just get straight into it. And if Yashi wants to add a bit more on her background, we'll go into it. So I'll just start off with the first comment. The first comment is, I believe we're about to move into a 5th green consumer wave. And, the previous waves were in the 60s, the late 80s, particularly with, the emergence of Mrs. Thatcher finding a hole in the ozone layer and various things. The advent of a bestseller called The Green Consumer Guide. The 2000s, we saw a lot of issues around what is people's sort of personal carbon footprint. And prior to the pandemic, we saw a whole new wave driven by youth, particularly driven by Greta Thunberg, and the sort of digital native strategy, of being able to get the message out, and perhaps the Generation Z wanting to be more active than the millennials. So we saw the protests around the world. And I think that this pandemic will lead us to another wave of activity, but also the social and health concerns coming on top of climate change. So I think we're just seeing that emerging area. And cricket gear, actually, in thinking about it in comparison with a lot of other sports, there's relatively a lot of gear is needed to play the game, even as a player. So there is all sorts of gear, there. And if we focus on cricket bats, we see a lot of the, majority of the bats still made from willow, as far as I understand it. But we also see in the sector, it's often very craft-based, or has been craft-based, with a lot of the, particularly, the smaller manufacturers. But actually, in researching this, I reminded myself of a bat called Woodworm that was developed by a guy called Joe Sillett, and the Woodworm bat came into the public domain around the Ashes of Peterson and Flintoff. But I was there at the game where Joe Sillett scored 100 from a bat that had woodworms in the back of it, and that led to the idea of the Woodworm Cricket Company, which was formed in Billingshurst in Sussex. But the point here, other than just the connection there, was even for a small startup business there of 5 people, he was outsourcing his manufacturing of the bats to Taiwan, India, China, and Indonesia. So he wasn't producing the bats locally. So there is this whole mix on equipment around, complex supply chains that spread out, particularly into Asia. And we have seen some innovations. So, we did have Dennis Lilly, trialing an aluminium bat, which was fairly quickly banned. And now we have, plastic bats that are being used, particularly in kids cricket and in junior levels. But we have a whole issue there, what happens to these bats at the end of life. And I know that there has been some exploration of looking at recycling schemes, and could we develop these systems to collect the bats and the polymers within them and produce sort of second life bats or third life bats. So if we focus on clothing, particularly, we do have significant volumes of clothing that are bought and used, if you like, within the global cricket sector, from all the level down, from international right to club level. And these are often produced in outsourced manufacturing, particularly in Asia. And we may see specialist outsourced clothing manufacturers that are producing different brands' products. But we don't really know, as sort of Chris was intimating a bit, very much about this sort of issue, because the sector has not really had the visibility, perhaps, of other sectors. So in trying to, unpick some of the complexity of these issues, what I, myself and Yashi did was to use the Sustainable Development Goals, which were relaunched or were launched in December 2015 as a sort of recalibration of the Sustainable Development Agenda, to try and sort of break down some of the issues in relation to some of the gear. And what we found, when we clustered the different environmental, social, and economic goals here, and we looked at different equipment, we found, similar sets of issues. And particularly, if you're looking at the environmental side, you're seeing issues there to do with the use of dyes, chemicals, potentially water pollution in those outsourced factories. You're seeing maybe, all elements of items going to landfills. You're also seeing some element, I'll come back to this, actually of actually, in the jargon, product life extension. Any of us who've been particularly, I think, and it's from Joe's level, higher and down to the club level. If we find a bat that we really like, we want to keep that bat going. So people using tape, your specialist repairers. So there's actually a really good practice example here of circular economy here with people, extending the life of their bats. Slightly different issue with a polyester shirt, but, in terms of circular economy thinking, cricket bats is quite an interesting example. So what we also have is all the embedded carbon associated with those globalized supply chains and also embedded water. If a lot of the equipment is being produced around the world, you've got this embedded carbon. And we've also got, particularly when you're looking at the clothing issues, particularly the polyester and petroleum-based polymers that are used in some of the clothing, you've got issues to do with microplastics emerging, and the whole plastics agenda is growing importance. So, probably if you aggregate it, you've got probably quite significant microplastics issues associated with the washing of polyester shirts, etc. If we then look at social dimension, again, we've got a lot of uncertainty here, and given again that outsourced manufacturing, into Asia, possibly, no health insurance for workers, mostly women employed. So there's a lot of uncertainty there about these elements of the sector. And if we then look at the economic aspects, we've got, quite a significant, although I've not seen any figures on this, quite a significant sector. Once you start to break it down and look at the volume of units and that are potentially produced, and Yashi will expand on that with a very interesting slide. You've got the economic issues to do with the whole value chain associated with the gear, from manufacturing right through to the platform selling the gear, through to big sports retailers, etc. Some of the academies, the training camps, the schools that are emerging. It's got a whole sort of economic value associated with the sector, but you've also got that sort of some of those issues to do with, is it social, is it economic, the wages that people are paid to produce the socks and the trousers, etc. Also potentially unsafe working practice. We just don't know. There's so much uncertainty around this. And then in terms of innovation and infrastructure, particularly in the sector, maybe there hasn't been so much product innovation, and maybe that's something that we can pick up in the discussion. So I'll now pass the ball across to Yashi to focus on a bit more detail on the clothing side.
Thank you, Martin. So here we'll be talking about clothing in the cricket sector. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So clothing industry on a higher level, if we think about it, we all are associated with it. And it is the second largest polluting sector right after oil and gas. That doesn't come in our minds like right away, but it is unfortunately the second largest polluting industry, and it accounts for up to 10% of the global carbon emissions, which is actually more than all the maritime shipping and the international flights combined pre-pandemic. It also leads to the waste, which is more than $500 billion on an annual basis, because the waste produced by this industry is humongous. It is said that one garbage truck of clothing is either incinerated or landfilled every second globally. It also accounts for the 20% of industrial wastewater pollution. So the picture with the purple foam, that actually indicates the water pollution in one of the rivers in Asia. And in fact, there is a saying in China that if you want to know the next in color of the season, just look at the color of the rivers. And it's pretty sad. And then when we kind of shift towards the social aspects of it, there are multiple issues associated with the clothing industry. To begin with, just to give you an example, there are wages, which is less than $100 per month for the workers who are working in those garment factories. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why are we talking about clothing and why are we going into the details? Here, I just wanted to kind of help everybody see that how one given cricket match has that impact and how the cricket gear can make a difference. So on any given cricket match, right, this is the very minimum, very simple example. So there are 22 players from both the teams, 2 umpires, which is 24 people. I'm calculating the minimum of 2 outfit pieces, so just a shirt and the trouser and the socks, right? And that's all we are focusing on right now. That alone, just for that group, adds up to 96 articles of textile products. So there is a huge, the entire mingling between the clothing industry and the cricket sector, especially focusing on the gear of the cricket in a given cricket match, is huge. So we have about 24 t-shirts, we have about 24 trousers and 48 socks. Next slide, please. We'll be focusing our next slide on just the polyester shirt. As Christopher started, that polyester is mostly used. It is one of the most common ones to be used. So here we kind of dig a little bit deeper into the environmental impacts from that one polyester shirt. So if we talk about the carbon emissions, there is 5.5 kilograms of carbon emissions associated with it. If we kind of put it into what we can all relate to, it is equivalent to 22.2 kilometers of a passenger vehicle driven. Again, it is not a very big amount, but going back to, we have 24 minimum shirts on the cricket ground at any given time, right? That's the minimum. When we do the math, it comes down to 532 kilometers driven by the same passenger vehicle. Now that's what kind of gives us that idea that how big that pollution is. And now we kind of, if we look into, there are so many other people who are present on the cricket ground. All other than those 24 in the very beginning. Then we kind of dig deeper into the ink and the dyes. As you all know, all cricket teams have their own colors, and then for which different type of dyes are used. And then all the gear, the shirts, they are screen printed. So different type of inks are used. Now the inks and the dyes which are used for polyester are dispersed dyes and dispersed inks. They have heavy metals and toxic chemicals. Now they have a runoff, again, going back to that purple foam example, they have a very easy runoff in our water streams. Then when we talk about some of the very basic finishing that we see on the sports gear, the UV finish and the wicking that keeps the player comfortable. And these 2 finishes are the very least ones that I picked, which we all can find even if we want to buy sportswear for ourselves. And that also leads to the water pollution. All those chemicals, some of them are nanoparticles, and they're going into the water stream, not only polluting the water stream, but also it is being ingested by the marine animals. And unfortunately, it turns around and we, the humans, we are consuming those marine animals as well. Now, when we talk about just the maintenance of it, the laundry of a polyester cricket shirt, every single wash releases about 1900 microfibers. Those microfibers are nothing but the plastic, because polyester is nothing but plastic. And that's how much it is released per wash. So imagine if the maintenance is, even if it is washed for 10 times, just one polyester shirt, it releases that huge amount of microfibers in our water bodies. Waste, it's a huge problem overall in the industry. And when we talk about cricket in particular, my question to everybody, to the sector, is what happens to the player uniforms? The player uniforms are dedicated to that particular tournament. Some of them are safe, some of them become the memory, those memories, and they are being stored in the clubs. But what happens to the others? Do they go and end up in the landfills as well? So that's something that we need to kind of understand better and dig deeper into. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, this particular slide kind of talks about the social impacts associated with the industry. Here we go a little bit deeper into it. And all these social issues in this industry, the garment industry, were not such a big issue before 2013, when the building collapsed this building that you see towards the right bottom is called Rana Plaza. That had happened in Bangladesh, and it was a garment factory where it just collapsed because the infrastructure of the garment factory was not that strong, and it just collapsed, which led to more than 1,100 people died instantly. And nobody was able to take, none of the companies took responsibility that our clothes were being manufactured in that garment factory. However, there was this new revolution formed, which is called Who Made My Clothes in Fashion Revolution. They started digging into all the material from the collapse, and they found so many big brands that we know of and that we all use. And that's how all these things started. The wages, as I mentioned earlier, it's less than $100 a month, which is not even, which is actually 1/3 of what you would need even living in Bangladesh for living, for actually coming under the living wages category. The working conditions are really poor. It is said that on an average, every garment factory in globally reports about 1.7 fires every day. But this is only the reported fires. There are so many which just goes without report. Then the health insurance, there is no health insurance provided to these garment factory workers. Worker safety, there are more than 80 million people who are employed in this industry, and most of them are women. There is no guidance on the workers' safety. Some of the companies are taking a stand, but there is a very, very long way ahead. Next slide, please. Thank you. So these are all the issues. How do we change it? Of course, we have the power to change it. Next slide, please. Some of the innovations in the material that can help change, because remember, we go back to polyester. It is one of the materials that is used very commonly in the entire cricket gear kit. What if we start using the recycled plastic bottles? It was used actually by Nike. There was a collaboration back in 2015 between the Indian team and Nike, and they created that from the entire kit was actually manufactured from the recycled plastic, which was used as polyester fiber for the uniforms. Bamboo, which Christopher mentioned, he is wearing as well today, which is great. Tencel, this is one of the newest fibers, which is 99.99%. It recovers all the water that is being used in its construction. So all those issues about the inks and the dyes, it can be recovered, and none of that goes into the water streams. One of the interesting ones is coming from the coffee waste directly to the sports uniform. There is an English soccer club called Forest Green Rovers. They recently launched their uniforms made out of coffee waste. Biosynthetics, it's polylactic acid. Basically, in this one, what we're doing is using the corn and the starch and sugars coming from corn industry, from sometimes even soybean industry, and then using that to convert it into fibers and using very minimum chemicals, which are known to be safe chemicals. We have also seen some of the innovations coming from the other waste industries, such as pineapple, and we've also seen orange fiber as well. Next slide, please. Econile, this is another example coming from the polyester and then transforming, it is coming from the nylon yarn, and then it is being converted into the uniforms. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here is another example where it is the Econile fiber being used, and then they have used the plastic bottles into it to convert it into the uniforms. Next slide, please. Thank you. Martin?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So that, just to reinforce the last point there from Yashi, so those fibers, the Econile fibers coming from waste fishing nets. There's a nylon fiber that is and repolymerized to produce this second life fiber that is then going into various items. So those shirts that those guys were wearing in the Bundesliga came from waste fishing nets. So we're now going to sort of look a bit about what could you do in terms of product development and design across that equipment. So, you know, in the jargon, the term is eco-design. So it's about integrating environmental considerations into product development and design, particularly going to focus on the issue of circularity, because this is generally a materials-based product. In the use phase of the products, energy is generally not used. So it's a very much a materials-based product. So design and developers of those products really should be starting to think about, you know, how could they reduce energy? How could they reduce water, materials through each stage of the life cycle? And every product does have a life cycle, you know, whether it's, you know, a bat, it starts with a willow, or with a helmet, you've got multiple sources there because you've got multiple materials, metals, I imagine. Probably you've got plastic components there. And then you've got even a fabric covering the helmet and maybe other, and foam probably on the ears, and then plastic at the back now. For some of the helmets. So every product has a life cycle. It starts with materials, and then they're produced, they're packaged, you know, they're used, and then they can end up, you know, incinerated. But that's, of course, right down the line, and not the goal as such. And in the jargon, once we start to look at the idea of the circular economy, we've got a different mix of materials there. So we've got materials that come from the, you know, that are biological nutrients, so wood, for example, and bats, you know, come from wood, if you like. Then we've got the idea of the products based on technical nutrients, so polymers and metals, for example. And again, the helmet example there is an example there, and the polyester shirt indeed is an example there. But then, of course, we do have some cotton shirts still. When I played, I think we got sponsored one year. We had some very nice cotton shirts that were overprinted with the logo. So if a developer and designer and developer of that equipment wanted to start to think about, you know, how do we impact on those issues, the huge issues to do with waste, for example. Of course, we've got, you know, climate change, air pollution, biodiversity issues. But if we wanted to look at resource depletion, what could the designer and developer of the equipment do? Well, they could you know, start to think about the materials, the content of the materials they use, the amount of volume materials, and then at the design and development level, they could then think about, well, could we reduce the weight? And I think over the years, we've seen more lightweighting of gloves, for example. Could we reduce the components in the products? Could we change the materials? So could we shift towards, you know, bamboo, as we've given the example, and can we reduce the number of materials? Because that's also an issue. The more materials, you know, the mixture of, if we have a mixture of materials, when the product comes to the end of life, you know, they're more difficult to recycle. So, you know, projects should increasingly be, you know, I'm thinking of bags here and things like that, easier to disassemble when they come to the end of life. So in a book that I did, it started to really reframe this issue away from waste to thinking about how could we retain the value of products, materials, and components as long as possible in economic and social systems. So how could we retain the value in that cricket equipment for as long as possible? And we can look at, you know, different strategies to do that. So it's this idea of designing for life cycle, getting the products back, you know, extending the life, you know, again, reinforcing what we talked about, thinking about gloves here. Could we further reduce the weight could we make them lighter, but still retaining the, you know, the functional areas in terms of, you know, not breaking a finger, etc. Could we look at different materials? Could we recycle materials? And I'll come back to a little case study in a moment on that. Could we shift away from virgin materials? Could we use so-called vegan leathers, you know, Pinatex that Yeshi mentioned, also now the Deserto, which is coming from cactus, and others that are emerging as well. Could we actually simplify the components in a product? so there are various things we can do. And there are other strategies one could apply at different parts of the life cycle here we haven't got time to go into. But it's also important to think holistically on this, and particularly if we're looking at a global dimension, what mechanisms could we put in place to reuse items, to go into communities, who are so creative, in that gully cricket and finding anything to play the game, but, how can we set up better systems to enable that? And particularly also in new emerging countries. So, for example, I'm picking up that Brazil is growing, and there is container loads of equipment going out to Brazil and other countries. So I still don't know quite the route of where all that equipment is coming, but this is another route to reuse material, equipment, etc. And these, as I mentioned earlier, there is a very good, I started to think about it, and cricket bats are a really good example of product circularity. We do look to extend the life of the product. We're putting tape on it. We're sending back, to specialist repairers if we found a really good bat, etc. So it's quite an interesting story there of sort of like product life extension. But we have this very perverse example of the Grace Nichols offcut gloves. So this was Grace Nichols starting to think a bit creatively about upcycling, and they took various offcuts from the manufacturing process, and they produced these gloves that Sam Billings, showcased in a warm-up game in New Zealand a couple of years ago. But after he wore it on TV, the match referee, Andy Pycroft, in effect deemed the gloves to be illegal because of they contravened ICC standards. And just quoting here from an example, regulations require that 50% or more of gloves in white ball internationals must be white or the same color as the base color of the relevant team's playing shirt. So you've got a really perverse, in my opinion, I'm speaking a personal view here, a very perverse system there to really crush innovation there. This is a very good example. It was functional, it worked as far as I understood it. It was really starting to tackle, as an example, some of those waste issues. And anything that extends the life of materials is actually going to be saving CO2 emissions because you're not using another virgin material there. So there's a direct CO2 impact. But it was banned. And as far as I understand, it's still banned, at least in televised tournaments. But in closing here, what we're also seeing is the emergence of new technologies starting to come into the sector. And Spectracom is a new-ish company, as far as I understood, set up by Anil Kumble, the ex-Indian Test cricketer, who I think has a computing background. And essentially, this is a sensor that sits on the bat that links to an iPhone, and you can actually monitor your performance, your batting performance. I'm not quite sure precisely how it works, in terms of, maybe it's particularly thinking about speed, speed through the ball and things like this. Maybe the, angles you're playing the ball at, maybe it's monitoring, different aspects of that. But then there are other examples, and Yashi and I identified them. We haven't got time to put them into, including a smart cricket ball even, which I haven't had a chance to analyze myself, but I know Yashi looked at it. So just in closing here, cricket clothing and apparel and gear, could it be a medium to actually take forward the Sustainable Development Goals? So I'll leave that thought there. And this is just our details if, follow up. But I think for time, I'm going to stop waffling on and I'm going to pass over to the panel now. Everybody perhaps put their thumbs up if you can hear me okay, and please unmute yourself. Make sure you're unmuting yourselves. because I'm going to ask you some questions. So could you all unmute? Yeah. And again, we have on the panel, just as a reminder, we have Chris from Basis, we've got Joe from Glamorgan CC, we've got Yashi from Kahani, and we've got Niall from Sportswear. And and you're also welcome to just make any comments in relation to anything that we presented as well, if you feel, there's something that you want to make, a point you want to make. So my first question is, what do you think are the key issues in terms of accelerating sustainability considerations in cricket clothing, apparel, and equipment? And maybe as somebody at the coalface, maybe Joe, could you start off?
I think you alluded to it a little bit in what you said. I think probably the biggest issue is making sure the materials still do what they're meant to do, if you know what I mean. So they still protect you, your pads still protect your legs and make sure you don't break your leg when you get hit. And I know something that people have talked about is the material of the ball, making sure that if the ball was changed, it would still shine as it does and behave as it does. So I think that's probably one of the main issues. And the other idea I had was that brands kind of dominate the market, I'd say. So I think it's a barrier. A lot of sustainability is getting brands to actually think about it, whether that's finding ways to do that. But yeah, brands to think about it.
So sort of raising awareness, in the marketplace, maybe some manufacturers taking the lead, where's the leadership going to come from? Where's the drive going to come from? I don't know. Yashi, did you want to pick up something?
Sure. So, when we talk about issues in this industry, we have to again look at that there are both the environmental and the social issues. What we need to do is the supply chain in both the industries, right? Because cricket is dependent on the clothing industry. So we're looking at the supply chain. We need to understand the environmental as well as the social issues. And then the next step will be to prioritize and start addressing those issues. And what happens is, because so many of these issues, even though we kind of identify them separately, they are so closely knit together. So for example, if we start working on, let's say one of the examples for the dyes that is used for polyester shirts in cricket clothing. Greenpeace study a few years back that there was an Asian town and the entire river was polluted with that color. And when they went a little bit deeper into it, the people who live in that community, the same heavy metals and those toxic chemicals were actually found inside in the internal organs of the people living in that community. So now think about it. If we change the dye that is being used and the process that is being used for dyeing that particular piece of clothing, we are solving the environmental issue. The rivers will be cleaner. They won't have that higher toxicity. The marine lives will flourish. And on the other end, the community, which is dependent on that, they will also be healthy. So we'll have to kind of approach it in that way and start addressing those issues one at a time. And when we do one, many other problems start solving by themselves.
Great, and so we got also those invisible social issues that people would not really be thinking about at all. That are quite deep into the sector. And again, one of the reasons why the prices kept down, particularly for the lower cost, for club-based shirts and more retail shirts, is exactly many of the issues you highlighted. So. Niall, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think I've got a couple. I think Joe made a really good point about performance enhancement and having assurances that it's not going to affect your performance. Now, at elite level or grassroots level, everyone wants to be a better athlete. So fundamentally, you need champions like Joe and people that play the game that have exposure to highlight these issues. But you also need to have pilots and I suppose, embrace the innovation. We have, unfortunately, risk-averse people in high levels of procurement, and sometimes we need people to embrace the technology and trial it. Now, in my capacity in terms of sports technology testing, there's always ways to prove that the energy restitution from a bat or the fabric or the stitching, whatever it is it's a concern, there's always a way to prove that there's a solution. But we need people to think about embracing it, and I think that's the challenge. Is we need people further up the chain in procurement and probably high profile positions to take that step forward and say we can do this, and we will use this mechanism to prove that that's fine. And jumping back to what Yashi said about microplastics, there is a big issue, you know, with in every sport with this at the moment, and it's about having it's not blue sky thinking. It's not green sky thinking, it's doing the simple things right. It's taking the simple steps to make change. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes peer pressure or it takes publicity to make that change. And that's sometimes when government or governing bodies think at a domestic and national level, but then emphasize it at an international level for consistency and approach. So there's loads of really good points in what's been presented so far, and what Joe said. I think that we can take forward.
And I think there's a couple of points building on what you're saying, Niall, is that we can also take other work from other sectors. So there's, for example, there is, there's been various technologies on de-stitching. In other sectors, more corporate clothing from other stuff I've been involved in, and removing badges and things. So there's technologies that can be taken from the non-cricket clothes or sporting equipment sector that could be perhaps taken across, if one could find the funding to do the pilots, etc., etc. So also maybe just before I come on to Chris, just introducing our other idea in terms of the broader discussion is in terms of sort of like codes of conduct, and, you know, whether that's codes of conduct at a high level. Should there be perhaps some, code of conduct for manufacturers in the sector? And also, well, maybe I'll leave it there. Chris, what were your observations there and thoughts?
Well, one of the issues is rights holders, and the obvious example that you brought up there about Sam Billings and the gloves. So that, like you said, it's you would seem that would be an easy problem to solve, and should you allow that kind of really blinkered thinking to impact on something as important as so my question would be out to the governing bodies and the we're talking both national governing bodies and the international governing bodies. If they are going to take sustainability seriously, then this is the time to start talking and saying, well, we've got to try and align rights issues with the conversation around what is the most sustainable way of producing equipment, and if that infringes some arcane rights, then the sustainability has to trump it. I think, Joe, it'd be interesting, in your contract, for example, are you restricted in the kind of clothing you can wear or type of equipment you can use?
Well, clothing obviously is out of my control. You wear the clothes as a professional athlete you get given by your club. But I think sports equipment, it's up to me. It's up to my individual preference of what I want to use. And to be honest, when I came to asking around to try and find a bat company, I hadn't massively considered sustainability. If I had, I don't know whether there would even be any options of a cricket company that's specifically talking about it or saying they're more sustainable. GM's the company I use, and I know that their bats were produced in Britain, and that was a reason for me choosing them, as well as also being good.
Well, it's interesting because Martin and I had a kind of brief statement from them about exactly that. They plant as many trees and more and cut down, for example. So that's a good start.
Yeah.
And also, Martin, there's some really good questions in the chat. If
Sure,
you want to have a look at those.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, so, I mean, I might maybe, Joe, as we've got a real player on the. Also, are you seeing any raising of awareness? Because I understand you're sort of early 20s. Are you seeing the issues becoming more important amongst the generation? Do any of your other, the peers and your group talking or concerned more about issues?
Definitely, I think so. I think since I've started talking about it a little bit more, there's other people come up to me and say, I'm interested in this too. I wouldn't know what to do, kind of thing. So that's been really interesting for the last few weeks. And I think, our generation, they're obviously more clued up about it. And I have particular friends of people in the team that I know are really interested and clued up on stuff. So yeah, definitely more conversation. And even at a bigger level too, within clubs and national governing bodies, there's more talking about it, but then talking about it is different to then actually making the steps, isn't it? And I think that's the next step now, from talking about these are the issues to actually how we're going to actually make changes.
So something there about an action agenda, and maybe this idea of some sort of code of conduct for the sector, and indeed a part of some broader discussions. I found that FIFA developed quite a strong code of conduct, which even goes right down, not just look at the environmental side, but social audits of suppliers. So there may be some other examples from other sectors. And as Chris said, there is a rash of questions coming in here. I don't know if that's the right description, but anyway, I will try and pick some of these off. So there's one here from Stephen Sidlow. I produce sustainable clothing for B2B sports. Our biggest problem is helping sports rights holders move away from larger brands and choose a more sustainable option. So it's so. Does anybody want to pick that up? Maybe Niall.
Yeah, maybe if Joe was to start using it, then people would buy it.
Yeah.
No, but
send them my way.
Yeah. That's the point, though. It's about exposure, and it's about having the champions to spread that message. So yeah.
So there's something there about again, visibility. Leaders. People taking the lead, visibility. And potentially there may be a latent interest out there, particularly, as the women's game is growing. Generally speaking, all the consumer research says that women are greedier than men. So some of these issues may well be, more actually quite an interesting area for the women's game as well. So I've got a slightly controversial question here. I don't know I'll state it, but I can't, whatever the phrase is, I can't possibly endorse this statement. But massive issue is the greed of pro sports clubs that want to sell more and more shirts. They change designs every year. They have multiple shirts based on the competition. Not sure how that can be overcome. I assume that's more in relation to the large tournaments, maybe like the IPL and some of the, the 2020 tournaments. Yeah. Again, does anyone want to pick that up?
Well, that's a consumption issue, isn't it? And that obviously comes within the SDGs and trying to reduce consumption. So I think that is an issue, and I do think that's a mindset that needs to be changed. And, you can't. I don't see how you can square that circle, basically.
Yeah.
I think education is also one of I'm sorry. Education is also one of the most important elements for everybody, for all of us, no matter if it's the player, if it's the fan, because once we start raising these issues, as we discussed earlier, that it's not just a one issue with that one industry. it is the same issues that we're seeing in multiple industries. And one of the ways to solve this is multiple industries have to join hands to start solving it, because it is not a problem that can be solved by one industry, one brand, or one team. It needs to be an overall approach where we need the governance body to kind of hold hands. We need the different type of industries to come together and then work together as a group to solve those issues. And all that can only be done when we start talking about these issues, like what we are doing today, and start asking those questions and start sharing that information, because nobody thinks that one polyester shirt can, emit so many carbon emissions, and there are multiple issues into it. So we need to ask and talk and go from there.
Joe,
And just
you were going to say something? No, sorry.
You're muted, Joe.
Yeah, I was just going to say similar to what Yashi said, actually. Like, there's talk about a lot of issues with sustainability in sport and in other parts of society, and there's a more broader thing than that. You can't solve it just within sport without solving it in wider society. So that's a similar thing, and that's the same as big brands too, bringing out a new pair of shoes every year. Adidas bring out 2 pairs of spikes every year that then everyone wants to buy because you want the most up-to-date version. That's the same as everything. So I think that's a more wider issue than just within sport and just sport clubs.
So I mean, I think one area that we will be exploring is putting together a workshop of different stakeholders from the sector. But maybe what we also need to think is a bit, coming out of this conversation, a bit more laterally about some of the indirect stakeholders who have an influence on the issues. So there is I think it's an observation here. The Lord's Taverners are involved in sports kit recycling. Many young people in the UK and abroad find it hard to access the sport, with one of the main barriers being a simple lack of access to the right kit and equipment. Our sports kit recycling program collects usable kit from across the UK through a network of local collection hubs. The kit is then sorted and redistributed to partner organisations within the UK and around the world. Well, maybe that's where the Brazilian kit is coming from, in those containers. If you have any unwanted kit that you want to like to send us, please, in a sense, send to the Lord's Taverners, and there's details there. So, but that's a good example that maybe there needs to be. How many of us knew about that scheme? I mean, I certainly didn't. It didn't crop up in any of the research that I was. I admit, I haven't got into great detail. Joe, are you aware of this?
To be fair, the Lord's Taverners are actually really active within the professional circuit as well, and they presented to us, I know, before the 2020 season, before it all got cancelled. So I know lots of the players. We have a collection box at Morgan that everyone puts their old pads when they use new pads for New Year in, or whatever. So yeah, I know that's actually, I think professionals are actually quite good at giving their old stuff rather than just chucking it in the bin. So I think that's... I mean,
but that's again a very positive initiative that's going on that perhaps is known within the game, but less aware. People are less aware of it once you get into maybe some of the club levels and right down into maybe even village cricket and things like that. So maybe that it's some of these good practice things perhaps need more visibility. It's not all bad. There is good, and we need to put forward some of those good practice examples. Do you have a comment there, Chris? Yeah.
Sorry, Martin, just a quick one from Neil here. Stephen Soldo, go back to the question about, he said it was business to business. I think there's a point here in terms of procurement, and that the quality scoring and large high batch volume, there should be emphasis on improving that, so making sure that the environmental or sustainability policies of the given company and the tender procedure is scored properly. It doesn't always have to be enforced or be driven, but in terms of considered, it should be more prevalent. And I think looking at like the EU's plastic levy that's coming in and things like that might help. But it is a serious question from Stephen. I think it needs developed in terms of procurement avenues.
There was a great question from Tanya Aldred. I don't know if you saw that about microplastics.
so Tanya here. May I ask whether clothes made out of recycled bottles are seen as good, as I assume microplastics from this are then released when they wash? I mean, Nash, you'll have a comment about that. I mean, the Patagonia has been producing, the tops since the mid-90s, so it's not new technology. It's become more popular more recently, but it's not new. And even Patagonia have had a goal since the mid-90s of, I think, donating 10% of profits or something to environmental causes, strong mission-driven business. But I imagine, and actually, pick up on this, please. I imagine those Patagonia fleeces must have been, delivering microplastics for those 25 years, even though they were trying to make a difference. This is the trouble, the trade-off issue.
So microplastics is a major issue that we have, even if we use the recycled polyester, there is. However, the recycled polyester, if we talk about the spinning of the fiber, the creation of the fiber in itself, when we're talking about the virgin polyester, it is per ton, it releases about 9.25 kgs of carbon. Whereas when we talk about the recycled polyester, it is about 2.1. So there is a huge difference between the carbon emissions during the manufacturing, which is called the spinning of the polyester in itself. That's why there is that push that if we do want to reduce that carbon emissions from this industry, we use the recycled polyester and not the virgin polyester, because it is directly coming from the oil and the gas industry. It's nothing but plastic. Coming back to the point of microplastics, that is one issue that the industry is trying really hard to solve it. There have been some recent innovation in the way the entire garment is produced, or it is knitted, so the fiber don't kind of fall off. However, it is not only during the wash cycle. Some of the very cheap material, unfortunately, that we use in polyester, they say that there have been research studies which indicate that the polyester actually just break off and it sheds. So that is going in the air as well. We tend to focus a little bit more on the washing, because that's what has been done. But recently there are studies which are just showing that polyester can shed because it's just breaking. And so there are multiple ways. Some of there are those mesh bags which you can attach to the washer, and then it collects all those microplastics. But we have a very long way to solve this problem.
Yeah, and I think that shows some of the collaboration also that will need to happen between new innovations in washing machine technologies, and also players like Procter & Gamble, involved in the detergent areas. And you actually do have, because I advised P&G around sustainability for a while, you have some waterless washing processes. And obviously, well, I say obviously, but I would assume that they if it's waterless, then you less likely to produce, or you can control at least anyway, the microfibers. So that's a slightly lateral way, one can start to think about that. Yeah. So I think there's a couple more questions. Are we still okay, Chris, for time?
Yep, let's give it a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Hattie Park had a question about...
Yeah, no, I have that right in front of me now, Chris.
Oh, perfect.
So interesting presentations. Are there many facilities in the UK which can take fabric, sports clothing, convert them back into yarn for remanufacture? If so, is there a list of them anywhere? What are the different recycling processes for different fabrics and cotton versus polyester? Well, that's quite a big question. In terms of, I'll just maybe start on the Econol fiber. That is an Italian company that have the Econol de and repolymerization process for the nylon fibers from the fishing nets. Adidas have used it for the Bundesliga, but I don't know if anybody, and I think a few other examples, but I don't know that any team yet has used that in cricket. Maybe that Indian example you gave, Yashi, maybe they've thought about it. So that I think there is about 2 or 3 organizations in the world that have essentially it's a chemical recycling process. To me, I still don't understand enough about chemical recycling. Certainly it can be quite energy intensive. And again, you have to, obviously you're using chemicals and there are big questions about what you do with the chemicals. So in terms of, apart from the Lord's Tavern as examples of the recycling infrastructure, I don't know. I think there's probably some localized schemes, but I don't know if anybody else had any comments there.
I just want to add one quick thing. Just a fact that less than, to give an example on a broader level of the industry in itself, not particularly on any particular fiber, but the human population globally today is not even 10 billion. However, the clothing articles produced globally touches 150 billion annually. And only 1% of it is actually recycled because of lack of utilization. There is so much of underutilization that products which can be reused or recycled, they're not being used to its full extent because the dollar amount associated with purchasing anything is just so low that we forget about the environmental and the social cost associated with that product. And coming back to the recycling, there are multiple issues in textile recycling because we use a lot of blends. So, and that's where the entire recycling industry is also looking into innovation, that how do we solve this problem? Recycling a fiber is not difficult, but recycling the blended fibers, so cotton polyester is one of the most common blends that we have globally today. And to recycle it is a complete, technology challenge because the way you recycle cotton is different than the way you would recycle polyester. So coming back to, we need to kind of go back to the way products are designed. We need to think of ways all the way. Today, most of the businesses are based on the linear model. You take something, you make something, you use something, and you just kind of put it in the trash. And that's what needs to change towards the circular, that there is nothing that is going away because we say you throw it away, that away is nowhere. It is right here. And that's what we need to do. We need to start thinking that when a product is designed, it is designed to completely disassemble, and then each of it should be able to recycle. And that's when the recycling would become much easier and widely accepted.
So just a useful stat, 80% of a product's environmental impact is determined at the design and development stage. So if the designers, developers are not thinking about these issues right at the front of the pipe, the problems are embedded. You cannot design a product for disassembly unless you're thinking of it at that stage. So, it goes right back to the beginning. There are a couple of questions here, I'll paraphrase them. What is the lowest carbon material that we could use, textile material? I think there's a question here about the use of hemp as well, and any comments there around what is the lowest carbon textile? Question mark.
I answered that question in the text. It is very difficult to kind of say that this is the lowest one. However, pencil is one which has won multiple awards from the European Commission as well, because of the way the entire thing is done. It is the simplest thing. They use the simplest chemicals and they recover whatever is there. So that is one of the ones which they say that has the least carbon emissions.
And again, you've got the issues there about production and consumption. It goes back to the Joe GM model. You've got a nice local consumption production model. It's the bats are made in the UK and used in the UK in terms of at least your bats. So that's, you know, and they're not being ported to India because, or wherever, or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Taiwan. I didn't know Taiwan made bats, but apparently at least they did with the woodworm. Because of course you've then got all the embedded carbon to do with the transportation of the bat there as well. So there's a strong issue, particularly, you know, a lot of those issues also with circularity to these more local, you know, consumption and production models. Saves energy, you know, carbon emissions, and also, you know, enables, if we design a system properly, to get multiple lives. So maybe I think for time, what I always like to do on these things, unless I've missed a burning question from somebody, is just to ask the panelists, you know, in terms of in terms of your thinking from the hour's session, the presentations, you know, whatever, what's your one thought? What thing struck you most that you hadn't thought about before, and what would be your one action? And I'll do it as well. I always try to be inclusive. I'll have to think about it. Everybody else. Does anyone want to kick off?
It's a massive question. I think Yashi's presentation really struck home in terms of the impact that, you know, just a shirt has, but then, you know, multiplying that up by the number of, and when you look at the IPL, you know, that's not going to get smaller, it's only going to get bigger, and it's being replicated across all the, you know, cricket playing countries, and America's probably the next biggest market for cricket. So yeah, that obviously needs addressing now, not kind of looking into the future. One thing, well, I'll go and talk to my club about seeing whether we can source tencel-based clothing, because yeah, polyester ain't the future.
Absolutely.
I'll take the next one, Martin. I think Yashi made the best point, and it's gone back to product design. If you can make it modular, single component, ease of recycling, reduces the carbon footprint, and it encourages people to have a more recycled process. And in terms of, you know, when we take other products in the market, not sport specific, we might lease a car for 3 years. I'm not saying Joe's going to lease a bat for 3 years and change it over, but it might be a model that might happen more often in sporting products, not clothing, but maybe in technology. And I think the key thing and the key message for me today is platforms like this is fantastic for raising awareness. So I think that this is a train, the carriage, that needs to continue.
So I think there's, can I say two things that
as many as you want. No restrictions.
So the first thing was the dyes used in clothes. I hadn't even thought of the environmental impact of the dyes used to make badges, etc. And then the second thing, which perhaps naively I hadn't thought about, was the social impacts. I kind of associate those social impacts with fast fashion and, you know, certain shops I won't name. And think that I'm being good by staying away from that, but you don't realize that how embedded it is in almost everything we consume. And then I guess my action is trying to keep encouraging conversation on this if I can, in any ways I can, and talk about it, whether that's within my club or maybe ask GM these questions and see what they come back with, and if they've ever thought about, you know, changing the material of their pads, changing the material of their clothes. So yeah.
Well, I think you have done your bit with that Daily Mail article. That was massively awareness raising.
Equipment didn't even get around to mentioning equipment. Really.
No, they didn't.
So,
no.
It's a thing, yeah.
And Yashi?
So for me, one of the things that I always stand by and I always try to do, and that's what I think I was trying to do today as well, is engage, educate, and encourage as many people as we can to kind of, you know, embed and embrace sustainability in their personal and professional lives. That's what we need to kind of, you know, shift the needle. And it is, as I mentioned earlier, it is not about one industry. It is about our future. It is about our future generations to come. And we need to continue having these conversations and engage with as many people as we can and educate them, to encourage as many people as we can to embrace and embed sustainability in their professional and personal lives.
Great. And I'll just add my 2 pence to the discussion. So a lot of issues, I think, in preparing this. And, 5 or 6 years ago, I started a conversation with Russell, the chief executive of Basis, when he was at MCC. And there was a lot of focus, which Basis are doing excellent work around venues and facilities, which there's still a whole set of big issues. But perhaps the time wasn't right to start to look at these issues. But I have a feeling now that the time it's all about timing sometimes. So we may be catching a sort of a point in time where these issues may catch some interest. I think in preparing the presentation with Yashi, I think, and some other conversations I had, I think it was really that the sector uses a lot of equipment, and if once you aggregate that, and Yashi's example of the 96 items in a game, you multiply that, just in clothing, and then you've got jumpers, you've got caps, and then you multiply it across the X thousand clubs in the UK, around, this is big numbers. So, and I think a lot of the sector is probably outsourced manufacturing. So the level of carbon emissions associated with that, as well as a lot of the unknowns there in the social dimension. And I think just it dovetails very well with an event we ran a few weeks ago, which just shows also the horrendous amount of waste there is in the clothing sector. And that's both the overproduction that happens, stuff going to landfill, and also just the so-called stored waste. How many shirts and trousers are sitting in people's wardrobes because they've not got around to getting rid of it. So, there is that issue of how can we, if there's, can we, if we're not going to use it anymore, what are the routes to help reuse that, maybe to communities, more deprived communities. So how do we release that stored waste, if you like? So, and I think the other last thing is really just actually getting the good news stories out there. Cricket bats example there, it's a really good circular example there. There's a lot of reuse going on. Players will extend the life of their product. We've got the Lord's Taverner's example. Perhaps there needs more. Some of these examples need more airtime. So I think just in closing from my side, and I'll leave Chris to finally close it off, is that I think it sort of reinforced this, for me at least, the need for this broader stakeholder discussion around some of these issues. So thanks very much, and I'll pass back to Chris.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah.
Well, thank all panelists. Sorry, thank you all panelists.
Absolutely. I was going to say, yeah, thank you everyone for contributing, because it turned into a really powerful and I think instructive conversation, and hopefully the audience found it so, and judging by the questions we got, which were again quite challenging, that helped to kind of drive the debate. And as you said, Martin, the next stage is a bigger, wider stakeholder forum, which we're planning for the end of June time. So watch out for that. So yeah, thanks all again. And if you do have any other questions, then please get hold of us individually or send them to me, and I'll pass them on to the relevant people. And thanks for watching, and keep looking at our website. There are more webinars coming up. Certainly there'll be another one on this particular subject later on. Okay, thank you everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.